their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I did not have sexual relations with her. You know, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat.
Hello there. Welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
No, I'm Chester Chadello.
This week, millions more Americans make jobless claims as some states start to reopen. Meanwhile, the stock market is soaring.
We're going to have the latest data on COVID-19, and there's some good news, but also plenty of concern that things are moving too fast.
Joe Biden is looking for a running mate, but pressure is increasing for him to answer allegations he sexually assaulted a staffer in the 1990s. We'll speak to a former Senator, Heidi Heitkamp, about that.
And could a third-party candidate swing the election? Justin Amash has taken another step towards running for president. We'll look at that one as well.
With the calendar ticking over to May the 1st, more than a dozen US states are pushing ahead with plans to reopen businesses, churches and other public places to restart America's stalled economy, while trying at the same time to keep some physical distancing to reduce the risk of contagion. That despite concerns that none of the states have met the federal guidelines for such phase 1 restart. State officials are facing increasing public pressure, though, to reopen, particularly from activists, including this group of armed protesters who entered the Michigan State House earlier today. State police having to step in to protect Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The protest there certainly worked. The Republican House majority blocked Whitmer's attempt to extend the lockdown for another 4 weeks. Almost 4,000 Michiganders have died already in this pandemic. But that is, of course, the vocal, albeit armed, minority. Polls show that most Americans are wary of ending these lockdowns too soon. While the growth in new infections and deaths has slowed, and in places it's even begun to fall, there's yet to be the 2 weeks of steady declines as prescribed by the White House plan. Meanwhile, the US stock market continues to rally. It was up more than 10 percentage points for the month of April, its best month since 1987. That despite almost 4 million new unemployment claims in the last week. That's 30 million Americans now joining the jobless ranks since the pandemic began. About 18% unemployment and rising fast.
Yeah, and GDP for the first quarter dropped 4.8%, even though the pandemic only went for 2 weeks of that quarter. So you can imagine the next quarter's GDP drop is going to be absolutely massive. Some people are projecting it could be up to 30%. Although interestingly, Trump's job approval for the economy is still up at like 53% to 42%. America is not blaming him for the recession at all, at least so far. Meanwhile, though, the virus is proving to be a stubborn fellow. More than 2,000 new deaths again today. That number is sadly consistent. Almost 64,000 deaths in total, growing at about 12,000 a week. 30,000 new cases today as well, and 1.1 million cases in America overall. So that is sadly very consistent. But where there has been change is overseas. Russia is now the clear number 2 for new cases. They're racking up about 7,000 new cases a day, and their hospital system is under immense pressure. This clip here, this is from a few weeks back, but you can see the lineup of ambulances waiting to bring their patients into Moscow hospital. COVID is doing horrible things over there. It's just, yeah, completely run the place amok. There's also been some changes amongst the states, though, as well, which you referred to just before. Today is the first day for 6 weeks that New York hasn't had the most deaths. New Jersey took over with 458 deaths today, although New York still has twice as many new cases as New Jersey, and of course New York still has way more deaths and cases in total overall. You know, I like to every week illustrate just how big these numbers are, because people get used to them. They get numb, they start saying, oh, it's just like the flu, etc. This week, I have the deaths per week in New York for the last 3 years. So these are the total deaths in New York for all causes every week, and you can see that they're very consistent until COVID comes along. That spike is a lot of death.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I guess we're probably not going to know to appreciate for several months, if not years to come, is that all these hospitals that have been overwhelmed and all of these people that have been staying in their home are suffering from heart attacks, are getting a return of their cancer. A whole lot of people are dying for other things other than COVID-19, but the system is so stretched, or they're not seeking help because they're worried about catching COVID-19 because they know they've got a history of some chronic underlying condition. So that is a really fascinating measure and a pretty tragic one as well.
Absolutely, and the point you make is spot on. Both Washington Post and New York Times have been looking over what they call the excess deaths, where they compare the number of deaths in the last month to the average number of deaths over the previous few years, because it's usually very consistent over a period of time. And what they found, I think it was the Washington Post found, even if you go up to just the first week of April, and that's at that point in time, there are only 8,000 deaths America-wide at that point in time because of COVID. There were 15,000 excess deaths at that point in time. So there was basically twice as many deaths as you would expect just from the official COVID numbers. Now, project that forward, we don't know how many of them are COVID related or not, but it's possible that out of that 64,000 deaths we just had, it could be as many as 120,000 excess deaths, which, as you say, maybe because of COVID, maybe it's merely COVID related, but they're still deaths.
Yeah, and I guess what that means is as well, we're getting towards some of the earlier modelling, the less optimistic modelling that was putting the death toll in the 1 to 200,000 range rather than the president's sort of more optimistic, we're heading for 60 or 70,000 of the last week or so.
Well, we're already past the 60,000 now, and yes, Nate Silver, who's good at this kind of stuff, the stats guru, he's saying you can expect it to be six figures by the time they're finished this year, but we'll see. This hasn't stopped Trump going back to his old friend, though, Happy Talk, even though the numbers are still going up and not slowing down.
It's March all over again, except this time it's the second wave that's not going to happen. We'll be fine, it'll disappear.
Well, even before the second wave, he's saying that the first wave would just disappear just of its own accord, which maybe it will. But I feel like he's already recorded enough attack ads for the Democrats back in February. I don't know why he's recording more. Just this week, the journos asked Trump what he thought was going to happen to the virus right now, and Trump said this.
But I think what happens is it's going to go away. This is going to go away.
Okay, so how will that happen if there's no vaccine? And he said,
without a vaccine, sir, why do you think the virus will just be gone?
It's going to go. It's going to leave. It's going to be gone. It's going to be eradicated. And it might take longer. It might be in smaller sections. It won't be what we had.
Don't say that. You just don't know. And if that's not optimistic enough, Jared Kushner seems to think that they deserve a lap of honour.
I think that we've achieved all the different milestones that are needed. So the government, federal government, rose to the challenge, and this is a great success story. And I think that that's really, what needs to be told.
Yeah. So that kind of thing's a really bad idea in my view, because not only there's still 12,000 deaths a week, like they're not going away. But something which has, I think, has been really overlooked is this thing is not over. It's still spreading. It's still spreading a lot. I've got the numbers here. These are the counties which have a high prevalence of COVID. So we're talking about the counties with more than 100 cases per 100,000. You can see there were 250 more counties with a lot of COVID just last week. And those counties covered 30 million more people. That's 9% of America's population. And by the way, those new counties are getting more Trumpy every week. You can see this is when this thing first started, only 34% of the affected counties voted for Trump. But last week, out of the newly affected counties, 48% of them voted for Trump. So he's alienating his own base by acting like this is all over. It's becoming whiter, they're becoming more rural, they're becoming more Trumpy.
Yeah. It's interesting, the demonstration in Michigan with the heavily armed protesters. It brought to mind the fact that there is something of a parallel between the debate over reopening the United States, the freedoms involved with that, and the gun debate as well. There are a lot of people in rural and remote America that don't see the risk to them as being in exposure to gun violence. They don't see the risk to themselves as being exposure to COVID-19. The risk to them is the large economic forces, or indeed the social forces that they fear of somebody invading their home and stealing their property. So very interesting to see now those Trump counties are being affected. What does the reality on the ground, when they're no longer just seeing this is something that's affecting New York City, which is very different to Bismarck, North Dakota, how are they going to respond to that? And what does that do to President Trump? And how does he counter that? Does he shift the blame onto local officials, or will he be fortunate in that those are the states which are less dense in terms of their population, people per square mile and so on, that maybe it's not going to hit as hard there, that the second wave might be a smaller wave that goes through rural America?
Maybe. Sadly, for some of the people who are being affected by this, the people who are protesting and Trump and the Republican governors, etc., they're not the ones who are slaving away in the factories.
Yeah.
They're not the ones who are at risk of actually catching this when they go back into work, because this is another issue. You've got a situation where a lot of these states, they're going back to work, and the people don't want to go back to work. There was a Politico poll just the other day. 73% of people said that they would prefer to stay home and not go back to work until this is over. And like they're not ready yet to go back to work, but they're being forced to go back to work, because if you reopen a state and that person doesn't go back to work, Kim Reynolds said this just this week. She's the governor of Iowa, where they've got a lot of issues with meat processing plants being basically petri dishes for this virus, and they're forcing the workers to go back. And she said, if you're an employer and you offer to bring your employee back to work and they decide not to, that's a voluntary quit. Therefore, they would not be eligible for the unemployment money. So, you either go to a dangerous workplace you don't want to go to, or you starve.
Yep.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and many of those 30 million Americans that have joined the jobless queues in the last 6 weeks have yet to receive their first check from the government. They may never receive a single check from the government because they'll no longer be deemed as furloughed, they'll be deemed as unwilling to work. Meanwhile, state employees, who can be everybody from your local librarian, your teacher, members of the fire brigade, the states are now looking at their budget bottom lines and saying, well, we have to lay off all these employees. So there's going to be another million Americans tossed out of work, often people doing essential services, public services, including firefighters, police, park security, all sorts of people that are involved in enforcing social distancing. They're going to be out of work. So it's a pretty diabolical situation right now with these competing economic and health pressures, and there's no one answer, because clearly the amount of strain and duress that is being placed on people by having no income and not being able to leave their house is significant.
Of course it is.
So you can see why there is this pressure to get out there, but we're seeing a lot of those dividing lines, those fissures in American society wide open right now. Well, we'll be looking at the latest developments in the Tara Reade sexual assault claims against Joe Biden shortly. But first, this week Biden announced his vice presidential selection committee would include his longtime friend, former Senator Chris Dodd, who joined us on the program just 2 weeks ago. Biden announced in March that he would select a female vice presidential candidate. Here's what Senator Dodd said Biden should be looking for in a running mate.
First and foremost, you want someone who could do the job. Lord forgive that something would happen to the president. You want to make sure that individual, in your mind, was thoroughly competent and capable to assume that responsibility. So that will be a major criteria. And again, and Joe's honest enough to look in the mirror and recognize he's not the youngest candidate to ever run for the office. And so having someone that could do that heightens that subject matter and interest. I think someone as well who can come in and give Joe a sense of comfort as well. The vice president, in my view, needs to go to bed at night and get up in the morning with one thought in mind. How do I make this administration successful with the American people? You can have your debates inside those rooms, argue about the best approach. But when the debate is open and the door opens, the president needs to know that vice president that he has chosen to be with him is going to be full-throated and endorsing the policies that the president has laid out and put forward. Those are the two major ones. That comfort level has got to be critical and important. Or what ends up happening is the president sidelines the vice president, and we lose the advantage of having a competent person in those councils of decision-making, where the voice of a vice president can be so critically important.
Now, my big takeaway from those comments, Jess, was Chris Dodd talking about Joe Biden needing somebody he was simpatico with, as well as somebody who's qualified, ready to be president, all that usual stuff. That, to me, suggests Elizabeth Warren is probably out of the running, because Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren, they've developed a bit of mutual respect, I think, through the course of the last 18 months of this campaign. But historically, they do not get along, and they still do not agree on fundamental issues.
Well, and also, I don't think Chris Dodd is Elizabeth Warren's biggest fan, shall we say, John? So I think she might be out.
Yeah, well, it is also going to be interesting to see, though, if Chris Dodd stays in that VP selection role as well, given that the papers today are already revisiting claims that Chris Dodd was with Senator Teddy Kennedy when he reportedly sexually harassed a woman working as a waitress in the 1980s. And Teddy propositioned actress Carrie Fisher on Chris Dodd's behalf at the same sort of time when they were kind of drunken wingmen yelling around Washington.
Yeah, look, that first incident you referred to, I think, is the one that sticks. It's what they refer to as the waitress sandwich incident. It was, you had Kennedy and Dodd were drunk in some restaurant one night, and the waitress came by, and Kennedy reportedly grabbed the 5'3" tiny waitress and threw her on the table, which was fully set with candles and stuff. She landed on her back, then Kennedy picked her up and threw her on Dodd, who was sprawled out on a chair. Then Kennedy jumped on top of both of them and, according to several witnesses, began rubbing his genital area against hers until some of the restaurant staff came in and caught them. And then you'd think they'd be ashamed or caught, they'd run away or something, but no, they actually just sat around and argued about who's going to pay the bill. So, different time in the 80s, but it's not a great look right now, I don't think.
Yeah, and also instructive as well, given the allegations against Joe Biden now, that the United States Senate of the 1980s and 1990s was somewhere between an old boys club and a frat house, animal house. You know, it was a pretty, different time, fortunately, but a lot of bad things happened. Our guest this week is the former Democratic Senator for North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp. She has plenty to say on women in politics and also on accusations of sexual misconduct by men in public life. She voted against the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh after he was accused by sexual assault by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. Earlier in that year, 2018, Heidi Heitkamp had also called for her fellow Democratic Senator Al Franken to resign after he was accused of sexual misconduct. Since losing re-election that year, Senator Heitkamp became the co-founder of the One Country Project, trying to reconnect Democrats with rural America. In March this year, she endorsed Joe Biden for president. Senator Heidi Heitkamp, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
Let's start with that decision by Joe Biden to announce back in March that his running mate would be a woman. How significant is that?
I think there were a lot of Democratic women, which is really a huge contingent, a huge piece of the base of the Democratic Party. I think they were disappointed because this was a record number of women who were running, and none of them made it to the top, even to the top two. And so I think for a lot of women in the Democratic Party, it was a significant acknowledgement that female and women leadership is significant to the party, but also significant to the country.
Well, using that logic, should Biden's VP pick also be a member of a racial minority?
I mean, I think that the single most important thing for the vice president to do is to pick someone that the rest of the country could see as president of the United States. I mean, it's not a mystery that Joe Biden, even though he's quite healthy, will be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, nominee for the Democratic Party. And I think a lot of people will be very interested in this VP pick, even more than usual, because of the age of the vice president. And so it has to be someone that the rest of the country could see sitting in that seat.
Two women, Geraldine Ferraro and Sarah Palin, have been nominated in the past for vice president. One woman, Hillary Clinton, has been nominated for president in the past. None of the three won. Does that suggest to you that women still have a hard time in America winning over voters?
I think you could go through each one of those campaigns and talk about why it was that Vice President Mondale didn't win the year he ran. Wasn't about Geraldine Ferraro. It was probably more about taxes and about the popularity of Ronald Reagan. We could talk about the Clinton fatigue, which I think was a big factor in Hillary Clinton's loss, but also she was running against a very different kind of politician. And I think the country was intrigued. Hopefully they're over that now and we'll have more electoral success in 2020 than we did in 2016. And I think if you look at Senator McCain's campaign when he ran with Sarah Palin, I think she probably hurt just because of the senator's age, and people couldn't quite see her as president of the United States. But he also had a run of bad luck in the fact that the economy crashed right before he was, before the election, and that created a momentum, I think, to elect a Democratic candidate.
So given what happened with the elderly John McCain and Sarah Palin, would you advise that Joe Biden make a conservative pick for his vice president?
I'm advising him to make a competent choice. I think that after what we've experienced the last 3 years, I think to get those swing voters, I think that this message has to be simple. I always laugh and say, make politics boring again. I think there is such a level of fatigue in our country for the drama that unfolds every day. And I think people want competency. They want a steady hand. And I think that's more important than figuring out which side of the political spectrum they're on, making sure that that person is in fact capable of becoming president of the United States.
On to the other big issue of the week, and you were in the Senate, of course, during the confirmation process for now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Some are accusing Democrats such as yourself of a level of hypocrisy now between the Kavanaugh case and Tara Reade's allegations of sexual assault against Joe Biden. What do you think of those claims?
Well, I think that every Republican who wants to raise this issue should look at the person sitting in the White House. And if you want an absolute example of a double standard, is all the Republicans who are now saying that this is unfair of Democrats when we're sitting with a president who has over, literally dozens of allegations of sexual misconduct. And so to me, those words don't hold a lot of sway. If you're going to talk about a double standard, you can't do it without talking about the man who is currently sitting in the White House.
So how does this ultimately get resolved, Senator? There is no Senate confirmation process for the president like there was with Kavanaugh. There's no active police investigation. These allegations are just out there. How do voters know whether they could be voting for somebody who would do this kind of thing or not?
Well, I think it's always going to be resolved in the court of public opinion when someone votes. I mean, your listeners will recall, probably with a lot of clarity, the Access Hollywood tape that where literally you have the now president of the United States speaking these words from his mouth. And the public made a determination that that wasn't a disqualifier for him to be president of the United States. And so the public has a way of sorting this out. I was in the Senate when Senator Franken left, and in a cloud of uncertainty about behaviors. And after that was over, I was one of the people who called for Senator Franken to resign. It wasn't a decision that I was comfortable with at the time, and I believed that it was wrong for those of us to sit in judgment. And so I think we're going to have to see how this plays out. And I'm going to take the vice president at his word that this did not happen, and that the opportunity that the public has to hear the evidence and hear the discussion, I think will sort all of this out in the end.
Now, you said the Vice President denied these allegations, but of course it's his campaign that denied the allegations. Do you think the Vice President should at least respond to his allegations personally himself?
I think the Vice President is going to have to decide how he is going to confront this allegation. And I'm not someone who would give advice, but obviously the allegations are serious. There is a sense that he should address this personally and make a personal statement. And I think that's always the best way to address this. But obviously, that has not happened yet.
You mentioned, Senator, that you now have regrets about having called on Al Franken to resign. Of course, you also voted against the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. Have you also rethought that? Do you have regrets about that vote?
You know, that's complicated because I would tell you that I was very engaged during that process and watched that process play out and cast a very unpopular vote in my state. But one of the issues that doesn't get addressed enough because it's all focused on behavior that Brett Kavanaugh engaged in when he was in high school. And I think there was a lot of us who are waiting, number one, for an explanation of that behavior, but also waiting to see how this person who wanted to be on the Supreme Court would acquit himself. I believe that that now Justice Kavanaugh lied under oath to the Judiciary Committee, not just about what happened when he was in high school, but about a number of things that happened in his life. And so it's really important that the person who sits on the Supreme Court not commit perjury. And I think that's exactly what Brett Kavanaugh did. Plus, I think, and I've been quoted talking about this, I watched the hearing with the voice off because I believe that's a way that people communicate. I thought the way he acquitted himself during that hearing disqualified him because of temperament. I'm a licensed lawyer. I've been taught to avoid the appearance of impropriety and to respect the process, and I don't think he was very respectful of the process. So there's a whole lot of factors that went into that vote, and people tend to focus on the allegation and not on how Justice Kavanaugh handled the allegation during the hearings. And I think how he handled the allegation during the hearings, even if you believed that he was telling the truth about that incident, disqualified him from sitting on the court.
The Tara Reade allegations are already being weaponised politically. The president and his supporters are tweeting about it, including fake digital lascivious images of Joe Biden. How damaging could this be for Joe Biden, particularly among female voters?
Yeah, I honestly think that President Trump should respond to the allegations that have been levied against him. And I think that he as a messenger in his campaign as a messenger, which is advancing grievance, he not that he hasn't demonstrated the ability to be a hypocrite throughout his entire term in office, but this really would take the cake. And so I would turn it the other way and say, you know what, let's have that discussion. Let's have the discussion about Vice President Biden, but let's have the discussion about your behaviors and the numerous and outrageous allegations people have levied against you. When someone says it about the president, it's all a lie. But if someone says it about someone else, it's not. And so the president needs to be a little careful about how he approaches this issue, because women in my country already see the hypocrisy of him advancing an allegation like this without addressing very strongly the allegations that have been levied against him.
Senator Heidi Heitkamp, many thanks indeed for joining us on Planet America's Fireside Chat.
You bet. Take care.
We have talked about the Tara Reade case a number of times in recent weeks, Chaz, and as you pointed out on Wednesday night's Planet America, more contemporary corroboration has emerged in the last week or so. And the media is now covering it fairly widely. Joe Biden is due to give an interview on MSNBC's Morning Joe program tonight, our time, Friday night Australian time, where it is almost certain that he is going to be asked for the first time about these allegations.
Yeah, and about time. The conservative press have been counting. 5 weeks, 19 interviews, 142 questions have been fired at Joe Biden since this came out. Not a single one so far about Tara Reade.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Isn't it a double standard?
Well,
Brett Kavanaugh?
Well, certainly if you compare it to Brett Kavanaugh, I guess you could argue in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, the clock was ticking because the confirmation process, a vote was looming, and there was basically a 2-week period where senators could ask lots of questions. Different though in the middle of a pandemic where you've got reporters being assigned to various stories are getting told to, oh well, this thing's popped up on The Intercept or this thing's now on a podcast. Tara Reade, who made allegations last year, not of sexual assault but of sexual harassment, but alluded to the fact that there was more to come, now laying it all out there, that reporters have, been doing their due diligence, trying to find out, well, who did she tell at the time? Now we're discovering there were a number of people, family members, neighbours, friends that she told about in the early 1990s about this. The difficulty I see, though, is unlike in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, where there were clearly other concerns. Heidi Heitkamp talked a bit about the fact that he lied about things like his drinking. He lied about several things about his high school and college years that were troubling, so that even though they found Christine Blasey Ford a compelling witness, they didn't necessarily believe her or disbelieve her. They could not prove what she said. They could prove, though, that there were significant inconsistencies that said Brett Kavanaugh may not be a fit candidate for the Supreme Court. The question is, where is the standard for a presidential candidate given Donald Trump is in the White House, given Bill Clinton was in the White House, given Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas is on the Supreme Court? And when it comes to allegations against Joe Biden, nothing yet of this nature has emerged. This may just be a one-off incident, or it may be that the two have different versions of what actually happened. We may never know, but the difficulty that reporters have right now is Joe Biden is many things, including inappropriately touchy-feely, but all of the claims last year about Joe invading people's personal space, even people like Lucy Flores were saying, but it wasn't sexual. It was creepy. It was an invasion of my space. He should have respected my space. He didn't. He then turned around and said, I now understand that the rules have changed. But we're dealing with something very different here.
Well, one of the interesting elements of this, for me, like, as you say, there is only one person on the record so far who's saying Joe Biden did this kind of stuff, the sexual assault kind of stuff. But it's interesting the way he's holding on to his records. His official Senate records, which are at the University of Delaware, I believe.
Yep.
And he hasn't asked for them to release those records. And that's interesting because it begs the question, why not? Why isn't he? Because Tara Reid is saying, my sexual harassment complaint will be there.
Yep.
Now, he can disprove her if he releases them and they're not there. So why hasn't he? And the fact that he has gone to ground, not just hasn't called for those records to be released, hasn't said a word, I think they're terrible tactics from him, because as far as I'm concerned, there is a 100% chance he's going to have to release those records sometime this year, because Trump will not let that go.
That is
There'll
assuming,
be
though...
6 straight months of this.
Yeah, but that is assuming that the records even exist. Tara Reid said that she made a complaint to Biden's office. Biden's office manager has said no such complaint was ever made. Now, that could be that she thought she was making a formal complaint. It was a verbal complaint, but no paperwork was ever taken. There were no notes taken. Could also be that she thought she was making a formal complaint and she leaves the room and they just go, right, that's not going to the University of Delaware. That's not going anywhere. That's going straight into the paper shredder. And so is there something at the University of Delaware? Maybe there is, and hopefully Joe Biden's going to be asked about that.
Yeah, I'm not saying that the smoking gun is there. I'm saying the fact he refuses to call for it to be released is a bad tactic, because he's going to have to eventually, at some point in time, in the next 6 months, I promise you, there's going to be some independent lawyer or someone who's assigned to go through his records and to vouch for it, whether it's there or not, because he can't spend the next 6 months stalling this. Trump will be at him every single day. And it's also, on top of this, he puts his allies in a terrible position, where if he doesn't say anything like he has at the moment, just been completely silent, then you have a situation where they put these talking points. Like, look at these talking points. This is what they gave their surrogates to say like a month ago. Biden believes that all women have the right to be heard and to have their claims thoroughly reviewed. In this case, a thorough review by the New York Times has led to the truth. This incident did not happen. But that's not what the New York Times said. The New York Times said that they looked into it and they found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Mr. Biden. A pattern. That's completely different.
Yep.
And so he's given these bogus talking points out to his surrogates. And then people like, say, all his vice presidential picks are women who were prominent during the Kavanaugh thing, so of course they're getting asked about it. Poor old Amy Klobuchar, she came out and she basically just used the talking points. She said, he has said, and I agree with this, you've got to get to the bottom of every case and all allegations. I think the New York Times, your viewers should read that. And then she said, I think this case has been investigated. The viewers should read the article. It was very thorough. So she comes out looking like a fool, because that is a completely different standard to what she had for Christine Blasey Ford 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And if Biden keeps on treating his allies with contempt, I think, like that, they're going to stop being his allies. Have a look at the Washington Post. They were defending Biden until recently, and now they've just had enough. They put out an editorial today that said, in the headline, Biden himself should address the Tara Reade allegations. And then they said, there are at the moment no clear conclusions, there may never be, but that's no excuse for not searching. One place to start is the records covering Mr. Biden's 36-year Senate career donated to the University of Delaware. Bingo. So now all of a sudden, he's got his allies calling for him to release it as well, because he's spent this whole thing hiding away rather than getting on the front foot and defending himself.
And yet, I guess, whether it's Joe Biden or his allies, they can look at the fact that President Trump was on tape boasting of a similar kind of sexual assault before the 2016 election. It didn't stop him getting elected. Since then, more than 24 women have credibly accused the president of everything from unwanted kissing through to rape, in one case, in terms of a journalist. So
they will say that. They will definitely say that.
And President Trump has simply said, it did not happen, prove otherwise. And that's where it ultimately comes down to the real problem for the accuser in this case and for Joe Biden. It can't be proven unless he were to feel as though there is some evidence that would be totally damning in those papers. Joe Biden will continue to deny this and say, my recollection is different. As you may remember this, I have no recollection of this ever happening. Then what are we left to think? That maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but ultimately, what are voters to make of all of this when they hear that Joe Biden is accused by one woman, Donald Trump is being accused by at least 24 women? The
problem is for Joe Biden, Trump has 19% more people enthusiastic about voting for him than Biden does at the moment. 19% more Republicans are keen to vote for Trump than Democrats are to vote for Biden. He's got a serious enthusiasm problem, Biden, right?
Yeah.
And this is not going to make people more enthusiastic. That's his problem. He's not very exciting to begin with. Democrats, they're settling for him, let's face it.
Yeah.
And if he makes them feel ugly about voting for him, they'll just stay home.
Right, and particularly given that Biden currently enjoys almost a 2-to-1 advantage amongst women voters, this is potentially the kind of thing that will have some women voters that suddenly see Joe Biden as their creepy, abusive boss. They may stay home.
And now, of course, there's another option as well, John.
Yes, Justin Amash. What about this? This is a pretty interesting development. Former Republican turned independent congressman from the state of Michigan, who has now announced that he is forming an exploratory committee to run for president of the United States on the Libertarian Party ticket. Now, he was a leading light of the Tea Party movement, elected in 2010. He quit the Republican Party last year. He was the only Republican in the House to vote to impeach President Trump earlier this year. So we've been sort of speculating for a while that maybe Amash was going to run a sort of a third-party presidential candidacy, or even run in the primaries, in the Republican primaries against Trump, even though he'd quit the party. But here's a guy who's basically running for president because he's going to lose his House seat in Michigan later this year.
Which is sad.
There are concerns, though, that if he runs, if he does as well as Gary Johnson did in 2016, the 2016 Libertarian candidate, and skims 4% of the vote nationally, but maybe 8-10% of the vote in Michigan, 100,000 votes in Michigan is what Gary Johnson got in 2016, and the difference in that state was about 11,000 votes. So Justin Amash, well, both sides are worried that he could lose it for them now.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. Of course, there's no way we can know. People will just argue with each other about this, but there's something I do know, that is Trump is loving Justin Amash being part of this race. This is what he tweeted. I think Amash would make a wonderful candidate, especially since he's way behind in his district and has no chance of maintaining his congressional seat. I like him even more than Jill Stein. So Trump is doing cartwheels, which tells you something about who he's most likely to affect.
Jill Stein, of course, being the 2016 Greens Party candidate, who did almost as well as Gary Johnson in some places. And again, you look at the votes for Jill Stein as a third-party candidate and Gary Johnson as a third-party candidate, and in a lot of states that proved decisive between Trump and Clinton, which is kind of interesting. But on that, which could, and Amash has yet to even get the Libertarian nomination.
Yeah, he might not.
He might not get it, although you'd imagine that he'd be a pretty strong contender to get it. But they're pretty funny, Libertarian Party. But interesting that unlike 2016, where the Libertarian Party and the Greens Party were on the ballot in all 50 states, the coronavirus epidemic has meant that the third parties are really struggling to get onto ballots. In a lot of states, you need to get 50,000 signatures to get on the ballot for the presidential election. It's just
You need to leave the house to get signatures.
You need to leave the house to get those kind of votes, and they haven't been able to get their act together to meet filing deadlines to do online petitions. So at the moment, the Greens are only on the ballot in 25 states. The Libertarians are only on the ballot in 35 states. Now, some states are looking at maybe they're going to just, Connecticut, they're going to let everybody on, which may not actually help because
Do you know if the Libertarians are on the ballot in Michigan?
I don't think they are at this stage, but I think that it's possible that they still will be. That's the assumption, that they will be. Wisconsin as well. Yeah. But so they're going to be court cases to get ballot access and everything else. But right now, it's very interesting to see whether, and again, if the allegations against Joe Biden gain more credence and more traction politically, if we get a repeat of 2016 where there's a high level of hate for both candidates. You talked about the double haters on Wednesday night. That's where the third party candidates start to do well.
Well, absolutely. Oh, by the way, I should say there is polling on Justin Amash.
Yep.
There was polling last year in Michigan that Biden was ahead by 12.
Yep.
And then when you threw in Justin Amash, he was ahead by 6.
Yeah, right. And Amash was getting double digits, I think, in that poll.
Yeah, and then there was a poll from USA Today this week where Biden was ahead in Michigan by 10. You threw in a third-party candidate, not Amash, just a third-party candidate. He was ahead by 6.
Yep.
So that would suggest it would help Trump. I would just say on that note that you were just saying, if it's a protest vote, which it's going to be for Justin Amash, no one thinks he's going to be the president, right?
Yep.
If you vote for him, it's a protest vote.
Yep.
Who are you more likely to be protesting against? Joe Biden, who's running the smallest target imaginable, he doesn't even exist, or Donald Trump is the biggest target I've ever seen in politics ever.
Yeah.
Of course, you'd be more likely to protest against Donald Trump, which means Justin Amash would be getting protest votes against Donald Trump, which would be votes that Joe Biden would have otherwise gotten.
And with non-compulsory voting, often polls of third-party candidates overestimate their support prior to the election. On election day, they tend to underperform their polls, unless you're Ross Perot, who got close to 20% of the vote in 1992. But even if you look at Ross Perot in 1992, his votes came very evenly, 37% from Clinton, 38% from Bush. So this idea that Perot cost George Bush a second term doesn't quite pan out, and that Amash may draw votes away from both, or people that say they're going to vote for Amash, particularly if it's a difficult election, social isolation and so on, people may just stay at home. So these are not real votes anyway. We'll find out, I guess.
We will.
Yeah, but that is all for this Fireside Chat. We'll have another Planet America next Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV, when we're due to talk to the Trump advisor who correctly predicted that Trump would win the 2016 election and how he would do it. That was 3 days before the election. Yep. I'll never forget.
Did
Boris
every
Epstein.
state. He just went right across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. He picked it, Boris Epstein. We'll get his take on 2020 and more next Wednesday.
Yes, and as usual, you'll find more on iView, Facebook and YouTube. And don't forget the PEP podcast with Dr. David Smith. Lots more to talk about there. See you there.
Good night.